Western Connection was when the market started to flood. And this annoyed Manga Entertainment very much. Manga Entertainment were predicated on the notion that they could release one tape a month and their fans would turn up and buy it, and that was an exchange and a community, and that would be fun. And then Kiseki turn up and they're releasing a tape a month as well. And then some people are releasing 2 tapes, and then East to West, they're releasing a tape. And then Western Connection, like, here are 4 tapes. And at that point, you're walking into the store with your limited budget, and there are 12 tapes to choose from, and this becomes an issue in brand loyalty. And so Western Connection were very much diluting what was available. It was a self-correcting market because people weren't buying a whole lot of Western Connection tapes. Also, Sasha's aims at Western Connection were much lower. He was happy with a couple of thousand video sales. His overheads were lower. It wasn't that much of a deal for him. Although he'd do some weird things, like we had Slow Step, which was 5 episodes. And he realised that if he cut 2 episodes together, it would count as 1 unit rather than 2, and he'd save money on certification. So he's kind of ripping out the opening and closing soundtrack and kind of splicing them together. So he'd do weird stuff like that. Manga did that too, and also Manga did something like the Guyver, which was a fascinating experiment. They released the Guyver. They released the Guyver across 12 tapes. Their price point was really low. They made 80 pence per sale, so they weren't making a huge amount of money.
That's no margin at all.
Yeah, but the price point was like £6 or £7. So a 12-year-old kid could turn up once a month and buy their Guyver tape, and it was super fun if you were 12. And inside the box on the sleeve, there was a comic that all linked together. And this was an attempt to encourage brand loyalty and to say, when you come back into if you've got Guyver 1, Guyver 2, Guyver 3, Guyver 4, and you walk into the shop and there's Guyver 5, you're naturally, entrained in towards, picking that up and not going for one of the other 10 titles that suddenly turned up that month. I run a lot of question and answers at public events. Normally Scotland loves anime, and we'll bring a creator over. And they'll have an entourage, and we will, put them on stage to talk about their film. But we've got them for a number of days. We try and make it a holiday for them. We show them around Scotland. We desperately try and make sure that they go home thinking, wow, Scotland is an amazing place. I should definitely blow it up with a giant monster at some point in one of my films. When you bring a Japanese guest over, they will often have an entourage, and sometimes that's a minder, sometimes it's a producer, sometimes it's their editor. If you bring over a manga author, it's often a chaperone who is making sure they are back in their hotel room drawing more pages before they come out. But when it comes to the producers, they're often people who are desperate to look busy, very concerned about the possibility that some fan is going to be troublesome, trying to micromanage what happens, trying to steer you away from certain topics. And often it'll be something really weird, like someone's credited as a supervising director, but actually they're just a name on the cast list, and they're a name on the credits, and they weren't even in the studio when it happened. And then for some reason we've got them brought here as the director of a film, and so I can't ask a question which is like, why did you do this? They don't know, and they don't want to be the one to say I don't know. And my real question becomes, why did you even come? Could we not get someone who was actively involved in this? The media will present them as a fantastic collaborator with their best friend. Actually, they hate each other and they don't want to talk about that other person. Naoko Yamada's people at Kyoto Animation were very sweet. They sat me down before we went into a Q&A, and they said, listen, she's the director, but she's not an auteur. She's very keen that you acknowledge the fact that this was a group effort and there are 100 people at Kyoto Animation who contributed to this. So please don't call it a Naoko Yamada film. Please discuss it as her in charge of a bunch of other people, which I think is a perfectly reasonable request to make that reflects a creator's particular angle on things. Leiji Matsumoto, the late Leiji Matsumoto, if you ever interviewed him, he would sit down, he'd go, look, before we start, if I say anything that anyone could construe as offensive, please tell me and we'll redo that. I don't want to piss anyone off. He was very keen on that, and it was lovely because he wouldn't kind of edge around an issue or not say it. He'd go, just let me know if I'm going to insult an entire sector of your country's population, and we won't do that bit. So that was really nice. I once interviewed somebody, I can't say who it was, but they'd very recently done a film. He hadn't been in the studio for anything, and it was a very interesting film with a huge fan base. Lots of stuff going on in it, lots of areas to proceed, and they said, please don't mention any other authors any other anime, any other works this creator has made. Oh, and by the way, he wasn't really in the studio for the animation part of this film, so maybe just mention the script. Oh, but please don't mention the script. And so I'm reduced to, so what's your favourite colour? Because that's, you know, what we're left with at that point. And that's irritating because part of my job is to generate content that adds value and doesn't just make you think everyone's an idiot. So Naoyuki Onda came to promote Berserk. He's a lovely man, involved in a huge number of design jobs throughout the last 20, 30 years. But he'd never left Japan before. And he was terribly jet lagged and very anxious. And all we got from him were yes and no answers. And so we took him out for dinner beforehand, plied him with whiskey, and it became very apparent that his producer, his minder, was this incredibly ebullient and friendly and sarcastic woman. The festival director said to me, let's put them both on stage, because she can draw him out of his shell. She'll say something insulting and he'll slap her, and they'll have a bit of banter, and we'll actually get more out of him. And that's the only way we could do it, because otherwise he would go, yes, no, and that's all we got. But once we got her on stage with him, bantering about what it was like going on a location hunt, and him revealing that he'd written this, he'd done all these medieval designs without ever seeing a European medieval castle until that day, suddenly he kind of came alive and he went, oh, I wish I'd seen a medieval bed before because I'd have done stuff differently. And, you know, and the director said, you know, we couldn't have a dolphin steak, we couldn't have a baked dolphin at a banquet because that wasn't allowed. But then someone found a recipe book for baked dolphin, and all these kind of weird stories that kind of came out. But it's very difficult to get people out of their shells because animators are shy people. A lot of them are shut-ins. A lot of them live in the dark all day and just draw stuff. And so when you drag them out of their kind of natural habitat, they're blinking in the light and they don't know what's going to happen. Jet lag is also a huge thing. You know, you bring someone over for a weekend, they still think it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you want them to dance around on stage and kind of entertain people. And that's a very difficult ask. Of course, the trouble is that once you have invested that kind of time and effort in a creator, if they're on stage for 1 hour after their film, the clock is ticking at 100, 200 pounds a minute. You kind of hope the questions from the audience are going to be good. And sometimes they are. Sometimes, you know, you get, you know, professional animators in the audience who want to talk about particular things. And sometimes you get people just making noises with their pie holes. And you have to kind of marshal that and control it. So I was on stage once with Tetsuya Chiba, the creator of Tomorrow's Joe. And I said, any questions from the audience? And the guy stuck his hand up and I say, I see you're wearing a hat. Osamu Tezuka also wore a hat. Is there a connection? He didn't know how to respond to that. I mean, if it had been intended as a joke, then I could have said, that was a joke. And he's like, oh, ha, 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 yes, foreign humour. But it wasn't. It was just someone desperately trying to say something. I was on a panel with Gainax in Switzerland. It was one of the only times that the top brass at Gainax had all been on the same panel. There was about 4 or 5 of them, and it was producers and directors and designers. And there was this huge audience of European cineasts and fans, and I knew for a fact the first 2 rows were a bunch of people doing PhDs on anime-related subjects. And the clock was ticking on them at $500 a minute because of the number of people that were there and the shortness of the panel. And I asked if there were any questions, and there was a girl at the back, and she said, I've got a widescreen television, and I put on Evangelion, and it's all squashed and square. Why is that? That gets interpreted from Italian into Japanese, and the Japanese like, what does that mean? And the Japanese asked the Italian interpreter for clarification. And the minutes, it's ticking by, There's an audience waiting for, and eventually one of the producers from Gainax says, I think you should read the manual. Why we have to do tech support in a Q&A is very, I mean, it's an interesting area, it's an interesting subject. It's not one you really want to ask the people who created the show. There are other things you can ask these people, and we've just spent $1,000 basically helping you set up your television. Someone goes, well, it's more of a comment than a question. And you're like, we haven't got time for your comments. Fuck off. With Scotland Loves Anime, the audience, we've got a lot of regulars. And they appreciate the opportunity to have these discussions. And some of them just want to engage. There's one girl who said to Naoko Yamada, until this event, I didn't realise that you'd made 3 of my favourite anime ever, and I absolutely love you. And I thought, well, it's nice for creators to have that kind of interaction. The thing to bear in mind is that Japanese creators do not get that interaction in Japan. In Japan, they're strutted out like show ponies. They wave a bit and say, you know, yoroshiku onegai shimasu, and then they're off. And maybe there's a signing, but even now the signings are much more limited because of the number of people who will stab you. And it's a very steep learning curve for a lot of guests we have. A big chunk of my job is reassuring them that I will handle stuff and that they are not on the spot. They are not representing their entire nation. We want them to talk about their work. There are no wrong answers. You know, it's okay to say, I don't know, or I can't tell you. No one's going to be insulted. I had Mamoru Hosoda on stage talking about Belle, and we had the audience in stitches, and he was talking about, you know, his favourite anime and what it's like being a father who made the film, taking your daughter to see the film. And you know, we all had a great time. And we came off stage and he went, that was like a chat show on TV. And I said, that's what it's supposed to be like. What on earth happens in Japan? And he's like, well, I wave and off I go. So that level of interaction is a privilege that we have outside Japan, but getting the Japanese to agree to it is often an uphill struggle. What eventually happened over the course of the 1990s and around the turn of the century is that the arrival of DVD solved the sub versus sub debate because you could get them both, and the manga tykes and the Pokemon kids became the new generation of fandom, which was much bigger and had very different expectations. And they completely crowded out the 500 hardcore fans who were running the conventions. And this was an issue in America as well. I remember Mike Toole saying to me in 2004 maybe that he was edging away from the American convention scene because, in his words, next year the Pokemon fans are old enough to drink. And that will completely change the way that conventions pan out, and he doesn't want to be there for any of that. And it was the same in the British market as well. The manga tykes grew up and the Pokemon fans grew up, and a lot of them stayed as anime fans. And that creates this much bigger population to draw from. Whereas the 500 video watching, you know, early adopters who ran fandom, they didn't want to expand. They were happy with their conventions being the size they were. They didn't want to be a creche for you know, sugar-addled 15-year-olds. They wanted to keep doing the thing that they do. So British conventions have stayed at a very solid level established by the fire and safety regulations of 1990s hotels. And so the idea of what a convention is has radically changed in Britain, because now you have the MCM Comic-Cons. It's a giant room which sells you stuff, and you queue up for the chance to watch a press release. And that's how fandom works now. That's what they think a convention is. It's standing around in the car park dressed as an elf. But that's not necessarily how real conventions work. I mean, I'll get into trouble for saying that a Comic-Con is not a real convention, but it's not. So at the turn of the century, you were getting 5,000 fans showing up at Anime Expo. That's still only 100 fans per state. You know, it's not a huge number of fans necessarily, but once you hit those kind of 5-figure numbers, you can start to create a shadow economy. You know, as you know, there are people who are like nomads going from convention to convention, and they might be selling fanzines, but they're selling 10,000 copies of their fanzine, and over time that builds up, and that can be a going concern. There are voice actors who spend all their time going around conventions and, you know, making their money from signing autographs, and there are companies who can use the conventions in America to specifically target fandom, in the way that New Type says, okay, there are 120,000 anime fans in Japan, but they all read New Type. So one advert in New Type, you hit them all. It's the same with the conventions in America, I think. It's harder in Britain because, you know, it's the size of a single American state. So you don't have those kind of distances and those kind of numbers that can generate their own income in quite the same way. There's this fantasy among many a weeb that they're going to go to Japan and become this fantastic anime creator. And it does happen. You do get people like Michael Arias going to Japan and becoming integral to the Japanese business. The unpleasant reality of it for pretty much everyone involved is you've got to speak Japanese. And I think there's an ease of access to Japanese material that's been encouraged by the fact that everything's getting subbed the moment it comes out. And I think a lot of the younger weebs forget that saying this is a pen is not enough. You need to be able to live and work in Japan. And even then, under Japanese working conditions, which a lot of people aren't going to accept. And, you know, and that's before you have to also be a good artist. The late Torrance Smith, who died, a decade ago now, he was a Canadian fanboy, ended up living in Japan and running out of money, and was given place to sleep at the Gainax house, at the dormitory where the Gainax people slept when they were making Gunbuster, because they're all fans together, and they offered him a place to crash. He would get up in the morning and kind of wander out bleary-eyed, and they'd say, "Hey, this is you," and they'd point at this handsome, blonde astronaut, and he'd go, "Who's that?" And it was Smith Torin. It was the love interest in Gunbuster, and didn't look a bit like him either. And he was very poor. He was taking the FedEx flights where you volunteered to be a FedEx courier, so they'll take you to Japan for free, but your luggage allowance is used up on the stuff you're carrying. So he'd be walking around like Michelin Man with, all wearing multiple sets of clothes just to get to and from Japan. And he ended up running a manga translation company, Studio Proteus, with his Japanese wife. They got fantastic deals because they were there in person and they were there at the beginning. And they did a lovely job of retouch and translation. Way over-engineered. When Tokyo Pop came along and just slapped some fonts on and punted it out the door, didn't even flip the artwork. And Torin's point was always, yeah, but my Ghost in the Shell translation is still in print after 20 years. Where's all this Tokyo Pop flotsam? And Jan Scott Fraser is a fantastic case of a gaijin made good. She went to work in Japan. I've tried to convince her to write her memoirs. I even offered to serialize them. So she got so many stories about the anime business, about Buchigiri, which was the anime that was so bad that the staff had a ceremonial burning of the assets once they'd finished it. And she ended up in Thailand running a subsidiary studio for I think it was for Artland, it might have been somebody else. But also I think we tend to assume, when we say gaijin, we tend to assume white man, and actually 70% of the anime business is non-Japanese workers in Korea and China and Taiwan and so on. There's a huge number of foreign names on most anime released, often hidden low down among the colorists and the in-betweeners. But when someone talks about going to work in the anime business, they want to be a character designer, they want to be a director or something, and that's incredibly rare. Although these days, every now and then there is someone who manages to pull that off. It's much easier to be a creator who has a work the Japanese want, and to then leverage that and to say, well, if you want to turn it into an anime, I want to direct it. So all you have to be is ridiculously successful before you can go to Japan and be made miserable by the anime business.